Susan, please wake up. I'm here now, Susan. I'll give you anything. Money, love.
The morning sun filtered softly through the tall windows of the mansion, casting a warm glow across the polished floors and pristine furniture. Yet, for Susan, the light did little to ease the growing knot of unease tightening in her chest. Kang was nowhere to be seen. At first, she thought he might have slipped out for an early meeting or a simple errand, but as the minutes stretched into longer, uneasy intervals, her stomach twisted with an unfamiliar tension. Something felt off. Ha-joon, blissfully unaware of the sudden anxiety that gripped Susan, crawled happily across the living room floor, tugging at the edges of a throw rug and laughing at the sound of his own squeals. His innocent amusement, though endearing, only amplified Susan's sense of urgency. She tried to focus on his antics, forcing a smile, but her eyes kept darting to the door, the windows, the empty hallways, all spaces where Kang should have been. The mansion, which had grown comfortable under their recent domestic chaos, now felt unusually silent, almost cavernous. "I need to find him," Susan muttered under her breath, a low edge of panic threading her voice. She scooped Ha-joon into her arms, feeling the tiny body squirm against her as she moved toward the foyer. Her steps echoed in the vast corridors, her mind racing with scenarios that ranged from plausible to absurdly catastrophic. What if he had left without telling anyone? What if something had happened to him on the way? The very thought sent a chill down her spine, though she refused to voice it aloud in front of Ha-joon. The foyer yielded no answers. Kang's car was gone, keys absent from the usual bowl near the door, and there was no sign of any note explaining his sudden absence. Susan's pulse quickened. She moved swiftly through the kitchen, checking cupboards and counters, half expecting to find him casually making tea as if nothing had happened. Ha-joon, curious and mischievous, poked at a stack of plates and knocked over a cup, scattering droplets of water across the polished floor. Susan sighed, torn between exasperation and a small smile at his innocent mischief. The baby's interruptions offered a brief, comedic reprieve from the rising tension, though they also slowed her search. She tried calling Kang's phone, tapping out frantic texts, but each ring ended in voicemail. Susan's mind leapt to the worst possibilities, yet a stubborn part of her refused to succumb completely to panic. Perhaps Kang was pulling a prank, she reasoned, though deep down, a gnawing unease told her otherwise. She navigated the nursery next, scanning the corners where Ha-joon had left his toys, the neatly arranged crib, the familiar warmth of the child's blankets. Nothing. Ha-joon's small fingers reached for a stuffed animal, and she handed it to him, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down heavier than ever. Her eyes flicked to the hallway once more, lingering on each shadow and closed door. The mansion, normally alive with the sounds of daily chaos, now seemed almost haunted in its stillness. Every creak of the floorboards or flutter of a curtain made her jump, her imagination filling in details her eyes could not confirm. And all the while, Ha-joon's laughter and babbling threaded through the silence, a bittersweet counterpoint to the anxiety gripping her. Susan held him a little tighter, whispering reassurances to both of them, though she barely believed her own words. Somewhere deep down, she knew that this was more than just a missing father or a prank. It was the beginning of a morning that would challenge every ounce of her courage, resourcefulness, and patience. And as she took a steadying breath and prepared to search the rest of the mansion, a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of foreboding settled over her. The day was far from ordinary, and nothing would prepare her for what lay ahead. The mansion felt unusually quiet, almost oppressively so, as Susan settled into the grim reality that Kang was still missing. Her mind raced with possibilities, but there was no time to dwell too long on anxiety. Ha-joon needed breakfast, and the energetic little boy was already climbing onto the kitchen counter with alarming enthusiasm. Susan groaned softly, adjusting her grip on him to keep him from toppling onto the marble floor. She could feel his tiny legs wriggling and arms flailing, a living bundle of chaos that demanded her full attention. "All right, little man," she muttered, half to herself, half to Ha-joon, "let's get some breakfast in you before we conquer the rest of the day." Attempting to make a bowl of oatmeal, she was immediately interrupted. Ha-joon managed to scoop handfuls of dry oats and fling them across the counter, a few landing in the sink, some cascading onto the floor with a dramatic clatter. Susan bit back a groan, trying to maintain patience while retrieving the scattered oats. Each step seemed to invite more mischief. He leaned over the edge of his high chair, stretching for a spoon, grabbing the corner of her sleeve, and squealing with delight whenever she pretended to snatch it away. Despite the chaos, Susan marveled at her own adaptability. She moved quickly, methodically, as though every spill and tumble were part of a familiar routine. Scooping Ha-joon into her lap, she fed him bite by bite, coaxing him with soft words and exaggerated smiles. When he suddenly shoved a spoon straight into his mouth, only to sneeze it halfway back onto her blouse, she laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're going to be the death of me, you know that?" she said, wiping oatmeal from her sleeve while Ha-joon giggled uncontrollably. After breakfast came the task of dressing him. Ha-joon, now animated with the kind of energy only toddlers possess, refused to sit still. Susan crouched on the floor, arms stretched and patience thinning, wrestling tiny socks over wiggling feet, struggling with a shirt that seemed determined to remain half inside out. At one point, he tugged at a ribbon dangling from her hair, pulling it sharply and earning a scolding glance, though she couldn't help laughing when he beamed up at her, triumphant in his mischief. Playtime followed, a combination of energy-burning games and improvised distractions to keep him occupied. Blocks were stacked and toppled, toys were hurled in every direction, and Susan found herself crawling on the floor, picking up scattered pieces while simultaneously keeping a watchful eye on the little explorer. There were moments of levity. Ha-joon's squeals of laughter as he hid under a blanket, his chubby hands emerging to poke at her face, and his adorable insistence on being carried like a superhero soaring across the living room. All the while, Susan's mind couldn't stop returning to Kang. Her growing frustration was tempered by the nagging thought that he might be playing some elaborate prank, testing her resourcefulness and patience. The idea made her chest tighten and her brow furrow, but she refused to dwell on the possibility that something truly wrong had occurred. Instead, she focused on the present, the task of keeping Ha-joon fed, clothed, and entertained, even as the mansion seemed far too big and eerily empty without Kang's presence. By the time mid-morning arrived, Susan was exhausted, hair slightly mussed, clothes spotted with breakfast and scattered toys strewn across the floor. Yet, in her arms, Ha-joon beamed at her, oblivious to the tension that had dominated her thoughts. His laughter, innocent and bright, reminded her why she had come to care for this small boy with all her heart. She took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and prepared herself to face whatever the rest of the day might bring, her mind still torn between worry for Kang and the chaotic joy of managing her small, unpredictable charge. The mansion, usually so imposing in its grandeur, felt unusually sinister in the dead of night. The soft creak of floorboards reached Susan's ears, dragging her from a half-sleeping haze. She sat upright immediately, Ha-joon tucked safely in the crook of her arm, eyes wide with drowsy curiosity. The faint, deliberate shuffle of footsteps echoed through the corridor beyond the nursery, an alien rhythm that made her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Susan's heart hammered, but her years of experience as a caregiver had taught her one thing: panic solved nothing. She gently set Ha-joon down on the floor, making sure he was safe, then tiptoed toward the living room, ears straining for another sound. Her first thought was robbery, a ludicrous, terrifying idea, but the absence of any sign of Kang all day had already stretched her imagination to the edge. A shadow flickered in the hallway. Susan froze. The footsteps stopped. Her mind raced, envisioning the worst-case scenarios: masked intruder, weapons, chaos. Then came a soft clang, followed by the unmistakable crash of porcelain breaking somewhere in the kitchen. Susan's eyes widened. Whoever it was, they were moving around the mansion like a bull in a china shop. Suppressing a gasp, she moved cautiously toward the noise, grabbing a heavy umbrella from the corner as a makeshift weapon. Every step was deliberate, exaggerated even, trying to make herself seem braver than she felt. The kitchen was a disaster zone. Pots and pans littered the floor, a spatula spun lazily across the tiles, and in the shadows, a figure scrambled to pick up a dropped wallet. Susan froze, trying to steady her breathing. Then the figure moved, too quick, too clumsy, and knocked a stack of plates over. The crash was deafening. Both Susan and the intruder jumped back simultaneously, eyes wide, yelps echoing off the walls. Susan decided she had to act fast. She charged, umbrella raised, yelling for the intruder to stop. The man spun around, startled, and they collided in a chaotic dance of limbs and clattering objects. A vase tipped over, narrowly missing Susan. She managed to grab the robber's arm, spinning him into a chair, but he wriggled free, scrambling back toward the hallway. Every attempt at subduing him became increasingly ridiculous. He slipped on a spilled puddle of water, crashed into a coat rack, and sent a pile of shoes flying, while Susan tried not to trip over Ha-joon's toys in the process. The intruder's exasperation matched hers, their mutual confusion heightened by the chaotic environment. Susan managed to grab him again, and they tumbled across the polished floors in a chaotic, twisting mess of limbs, umbrellas, and furniture. At one point, the intruder tried to swing a chair like a shield, only for it to slip and crash into a wall, sending a vase teetering dangerously before toppling to the floor. Susan pinned him against the wall with the umbrella pressed firmly against his chest, feeling triumphant despite the bruising he inflicted in his desperate wriggles. She could barely catch her breath, muscles trembling from the exertion, but she refused to let him slip from her grasp. He twisted and kicked, managing to break free from her precarious hold with a final, exaggerated effort that sent her sprawling backward onto the rug. The thief, realizing he couldn't maintain control, made his final move. With a desperate scramble, he bolted toward the main entrance, yanking the door open and disappearing into the cool morning light. Susan lay on the floor for a long moment, chest rising and falling rapidly, staring after him. He had escaped, but remarkably, he hadn't stolen a thing. The mansion remained intact in terms of valuables, though the chaos of overturned furniture and broken plates told a different story. Finally, she straightened, brushing crumbs and dust from her clothes, feeling every muscle ache as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. Ha-joon crawled into her lap, babbling happily as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Susan allowed herself a tired chuckle, shaking her head at the ridiculousness of the morning. Between the adrenaline, the physical exertion, and the sheer absurdity of chasing a thief through a house full of a mischievous toddler's obstacles, she was utterly spent, but triumphant. Laying there, Ha-joon perched comfortably against her, Susan realized that despite the chaos, they had survived together. The intruder had underestimated her, and in doing so, had provided her with a bizarre sort of victory, a mix of comedy, triumph, and relief. Her heart finally began to slow, and she allowed herself to sink into the moment, exhausted yet grateful that they were safe, that the thief hadn't harmed Ha-joon, and that the mansion, though battered, remained theirs, if just barely, for now. The room was heavy with a suffocating silence, broken only by the shallow, controlled breaths of Kang Min-joon. He sat restrained in a sturdy chair, his hands bound tightly behind his back, his posture rigid despite the ropes biting into his wrists. The faint light from a single bare bulb swayed slightly, casting long, sinister shadows across the walls, emphasizing the isolation of his predicament. Kang's eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, flicked around the room, scanning for any possible escape or weakness in his captor's plan. Across from him, a figure in a mask moved with a deliberate, almost theatrical precision. Her presence radiated a mix of fury and familiarity that sent a chill down his spine. It took him only a few seconds to recognize the subtle hints, her stance, the weight of her movements, the rhythm of her breathing. It was her. Linda, his ex and the mother of Ha-joon. A storm of calculated fury contained beneath the mask of measured movements. Every blow she delivered, every step she took, radiated the simmering anger she carried from years of resentment. Linda's face was a mask of controlled rage. She struck again, aiming for his shoulder, then his ribs, each strike deliberate, each motion a reminder of her perceived injustices. Kang had won custody of Ha-joon, secured the properties they had once shared, and legally defeated her at every turn. That victory had left her seething, the pain of loss and humiliation festering into a desire for revenge. She wanted more than to hurt him physically, she wanted to reclaim what she believed had been stolen, her control, her status, and perhaps a measure of dominance over the man who had humiliated her in the courtroom. Kang, despite the throbbing ache and bruising forming across his body, did something that seemed to infuriate her even further. He laughed. Not mockingly, not cruelly, but a low, calm sound that echoed through the room, small but deliberate. "Why are you laughing?" Linda demanded, her voice quivering with rage. She struck again, harder this time, frustrated by the unshakable calm in his gaze. "Because it hurts you more than it hurts me," Kang replied evenly, meeting her eyes with unbroken composure. The ropes bit into his wrists, his arms screamed in protest, but his voice remained steady, each word a quiet defiance. He had been through more than physical pain before, months of legal battles, negotiations, and threats. This was merely another test of endurance, and he intended to pass it on his own terms. Every movement she made was sharper, more desperate. She sought control, a fleeting sense of triumph to compensate for the losses she had suffered. She wanted him broken, humiliated, diminished, but no matter how carefully she applied her fury, Kang remained composed. His laughter, small and calm, was a dagger in her pride, a reminder that her rage, while potent, could not touch the essence of his spirit. He studied her carefully, noting every tremor in her fingers, every flare of emotion in her eyes, and every shift in posture. She wanted his properties, his son, and his submission. Yet here he was, tied, bruised, but unbroken. He met each strike with patience, each attempt at intimidation with measured resistance. Kang's defiance was subtle but undeniable. He was winning the battle not through strength, but through unyielding spirit. The room became a strange theater of pain and power, rage and resilience. Linda's strikes, driven by anger and obsession, clashed with Kang's calm endurance, creating a tension so palpable it seemed to thrum through the walls. Every laugh, every small smirk he allowed himself, amplified her fury, turning her blows sharper, her frustration deeper. And Kang, despite the pain, felt a quiet victory with every moment he remained unbroken. He would endure. He would survive. And when the time came, he would turn this moment to his advantage. His laughter was more than defiance, it was a promise. He was still in control of something she could not touch, his spirit. The morning had begun like any other, but the quiet of the mansion now felt heavy, oppressive, and unusually still. Susan moved cautiously through the familiar halls, Ha-joon clutched securely in her arms, the boy's small, warm body a fragile anchor against the rising tension in her chest. Her mind raced with uneasy thoughts of Kang, already absent for far too long, and every empty room seemed to whisper doubts and warnings she could not shake. The sudden vibration of her phone cut sharply through the oppressive silence, its unfamiliar number making her instinctively tighten her hold on Ha-joon, her pulse quickening. A sense of foreboding had settled over her like a dense fog, and the moment she pressed the answer button, her worst fears were confirmed. Kang's voice reached her immediately, raw and pained, echoing in the background of the call with a terror that made her stomach twist. The sounds were unmistakable, grunts of pain, the occasional sharp shout, and then the controlled yet menacing tone of a woman speaking with cold, calculated authority. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, yet it carried a dangerous precision that immediately marked it as someone who knew exactly how to manipulate fear. Each word she spoke sent chills through Susan, each syllable loaded with threats, demands, and a deadly insistence that Susan comply. The instructions were clear and merciless. Find the documents tied to Kang's vast holdings, prepare them meticulously, and eventually hand over not just the legal proofs of his empire, but Ha-joon himself. Susan's heart thudded violently in her chest, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down with a suffocating force. Every instinct she had, every lesson she had learned managing crises with Kang and Ha-joon, now collided with a raw, primal fear she had never experienced. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to calm her thoughts, and yet, in the background, Kang's voice rose again, strained, commanding, desperate. He shouted instructions, his words fragmented but urgent, telling her not to obey the commands, not to endanger the child, and most of all, not to give in to the demands of the threatening woman. But as Susan listened, as she processed the gravity of the situation, the clarity of Kang's guidance clashed violently with the terror clawing at her mind. The weight of responsibility for Ha-joon, combined with the horror of the screams she could not ignore, left her frozen in place, caught between defiance and a paralyzing need to protect both her charge and the man she had begun to love. The mansion, which had always been a place of controlled chaos and familial warmth, now felt alien, cold, and unwelcoming. Every familiar corner, every echo of footsteps she had known for years, now seemed a trap, amplifying her vulnerability. Ha-joon, sensing the tension in her, pressed closer, his small body radiating trust and dependence, a reminder of the stakes involved and the innocence she had sworn to protect. Each of his movements, once sources of joy and comedic relief, now heightened the urgency of her decisions, and yet the boy's presence also grounded her. She drew a shaky breath, holding him tighter, feeling the fragile connection that both anchored and constrained her. The voice on the other end continued, its tone unyielding, merciless, and disturbingly intimate in its knowledge of Kang and his household. It hinted at power, authority, and the certainty of consequences should Susan fail or delay. Every word seemed calibrated to elicit fear, compliance, and a sense of helplessness, and Susan felt her composure teetering dangerously. The instructions were clear, the threat unmistakable, and yet, paradoxically, the responsibility to both Ha-joon and Kang demanded courage she was unsure she possessed. As the call ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, Susan felt the room close in around her. She remained still for a long moment, holding Ha-joon close, trying to steady her racing heart and forcing herself to breathe. Her mind churned with strategies, impossibilities, and fragments of hope, desperately searching for a way to navigate the impossible demands placed upon her. In that moment, amidst the terror and the uncertainty, Susan understood with unflinching clarity that the day ahead would test every ounce of her strength, courage, and resourcefulness, and that nothing, neither the mansion, her charge, nor her own resolve, would ever feel the same again. The echo of Kang's screams still haunted Susan's mind as she paced the grand hallway of the mansion. Ha-joon held tightly in her arms. Every step she took seemed heavier than the last, each footfall a reminder of the impossible choice now weighing on her shoulders. The phone had not stopped ringing since the initial call, the same private number flashing insistently, and her nerves were frayed to the point of rawness. The moment she answered again, a sense of dread slithered through her veins, colder and more insistent than before. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, and chillingly informed. Someone who knew far too much about every detail of the household, from the layout of the mansion to the routines of its occupants. Every sentence was a calculated maneuver, designed to shake her resolve and plant seeds of fear she could not immediately root out. Susan's attempts to project confidence and toughness over the phone were undermined by the steady, invasive knowledge the caller demonstrated. Every precaution she thought she had taken, every measure she had put in place to protect Ha-joon and herself, seemed anticipated and dismissed by the voice's unnerving familiarity. The caller spoke with certainty, almost playfully in its menace, asserting that even if Kang had been difficult to capture, Susan would be far easier to control, far easier to break. The word sent a shiver down her spine. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress, suddenly seemed fragile and exposed, as if every wall, every door, every lock might fail at any moment. Susan's pulse raced, her senses stretched taut, each heartbeat a drumbeat of anxiety that kept her acutely aware of every shadow and movement around her. Despite the fear clawing at her chest, Susan forced herself to focus, trying to compartmentalize the terror and the protective instincts she felt for Ha-joon. She knew that her actions in the next few moments would matter more than anything else. The baby, sensing her tension, pressed against her shoulder, clutching her with tiny hands that demanded security and calm even as the world outside seemed to threaten chaos. Susan drew strength from that small, trusting presence. Ha-joon's innocence and dependence reminded her that she was the line between safety and catastrophe, that her resolve must hold where others had already failed or fallen. Every instinct screamed to comply fully with the voice on the other end, yet another, more defiant voice inside her reminded her that Ha-joon could never be sacrificed, no matter the cost. The caller continued to speak, layering threats upon threats, each one more precise, more targeted, more unsettling than the last. The awareness of being watched, of being understood in ways that exceeded even her most careful precautions, was suffocating. Susan's mind raced, considering every possible outcome, every contingency, every potential betrayal hidden in the shadows. And yet, she could not fully surrender to panic. Instead, she acted with deliberate calm, choosing carefully which concessions to make and which lines she could never cross. Reluctantly, she agreed to provide the requested documents, knowing that failing to do so might endanger Kang further, and yet she drew an unyielding line at Ha-joon, refusing to hand over the child she had vowed to protect with every fiber of her being. The mansion, though silent, seemed filled with invisible eyes, each shadow a potential threat, each corridor a possible danger. And yet, even amidst the lingering terror, a flicker of determination burned within her. She would protect the boy. She would safeguard Kang. She would endure fear, threats, and even violence if necessary, because no power, no manipulation, and no threat, no matter how calculated or menacing, could compromise the bond she had formed with the child in her care. In that quiet, tense moment, Susan understood with unshakable clarity that she had entered a battle far larger than anything she had anticipated. The day had become a test of endurance, courage, and strategic thinking, and she would need every ounce of her skill, strength, and ingenuity to navigate it. And above all, she knew that no matter how formidable the threats or how cunning the enemy, she would not allow Ha-joon to be taken from her, nor would she surrender to the paralyzing fear that threatened to undermine her every move. Her mind, though shaken, was resolute, and a quiet, stubborn fire burned within her, promising that she would meet the challenges ahead with courage, cunning, and unwavering determination. Kang had lost track of time inside the dim, stale room where Linda had imprisoned him. The lights buzzed weakly overhead, flickering every few minutes as if even the electricity hesitated to stay in a place so suffocating. His wrists were raw from the zip ties, his throat dry, his muscles aching. But his mind refused to break. He couldn't afford to. Not when Susan was out there. Not when Ha-joon was somewhere in the middle of this twisted storm. Not when Linda, with her cold precision and unyielding malice, still had the upper hand. Kang had replayed dozens of escape scenarios in his head. Breaking the chair. Faking unconsciousness. Creating a distraction. But every plan came with risks, high ones. Linda was careful, calculating, and far too experienced in cruelty to be easily tricked. But desperation sharpened his thinking. He needed to wait. Watch. Track her rhythms. Analyze her mistakes. Then, finally, one came. It was subtle, almost mundane, but to a mind fighting for survival, it was a crack in the steel. Linda entered the room again, irritated about something. She moved faster than usual, muttering under her breath. Her phone kept buzzing. She kept looking at the screen, jaw tightening. Clearly, something or someone was throwing off her rhythm. Kang's instincts sparked. She was distracted. She was rushing. She was sloppy. And that was all he needed. Linda pulled out a syringe, preparing another dose of whatever drug she had used to keep him half-dazed earlier. But in her distraction, she placed her keycard, not in her pocket, not around her wrist, on the small table beside him. Kang's eyes snapped to it. Linda didn't notice. Her phone rang again. She cursed under her breath and turned away, stepping toward the corner to answer the call. That was the mistake. He swung his leg, kicking the table hard enough to send the keycard flying, but not away. Toward him. Linda's voice rose, annoyed at whoever was on the other end. She didn't hear the soft scrape of the card against the floor as Kang maneuvered his foot, sliding it closer. His heart pounded like a war drum. One chance. One move. As Linda continued arguing on the phone, Kang shifted his weight, lifting the card with the edge of his foot and dragging it close enough to reach with his tied hands. The zip ties cut deeper into his skin, but he didn't stop until he felt the smooth edge of the card between his fingers. Linda finally ended the call with a hiss of fury. And she turned. Kang. But he was already moving. He surged up, slamming his shoulder into her with a force born from fear and rage.
Linda stumbled, crashing backward against the wall.
Her head hit the surface with a dull thud. Not enough to knock her out, just enough to disorient her. He didn't waste a second. He sprinted to the door, shoved the keycard into the slot, and the lock clicked open. Linda recovered instantly. He yanked the door open, stepped out, then slammed it shut before she could reach him. With trembling fingers and every ounce of strength he had left, he hit the lock mechanism on the outside. Click.
Just like that.
He locked her inside. Linda's scream was feral, pounding against the metal from within.
Kang.
"Open this door."
Open it right now.
But he didn't. For the first time since this nightmare began, he had leverage. He had air. He had a chance. Kang turned, adrenaline surging through his exhausted body, and ran. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what traps waited ahead. He didn't know if he would get out of the building alive. But for the first time, he wasn't the hunted. He was escaping. And he was determined to survive long enough to make sure Susan and Ha-joon survived too. The mansion, still bearing the marks of the chaos from the days before, sat in an uneasy quiet when Kang arrived. His body throbbed with deep, lingering pain from Linda's torture, each step vibrating through battered muscles and bruised ribs, but none of it slowed him. Every bit of his focus tunneled into a single, driving urgency. Susan and Ha-joon had to be protected before Linda could reach them. He had escaped with seconds to spare, and every second since felt borrowed, fragile, and heavy with consequence. His arrival at the gate was abrupt and unceremonious. He didn't bother checking his surroundings, didn't allow himself the luxury of caution. He simply shoved the gate open and rushed inside, consumed by the need to reach his son and the woman who had become a foundational presence in his fractured life. The driveway passed beneath him in a blur, and as he crossed the mansion's threshold, the familiar hallways sparked a fierce, instinctive protectiveness that overshadowed the pain of every recent wound. Susan appeared at the end of the corridor, her face transforming instantly from exhaustion to stunned relief. The sight of her standing there, alive, unharmed, hit him harder than any blow Linda had dealt. But there was no time to return her hopeful energy, no room for the joy that flickered across her features. His expression remained stern, controlled, honed into survival mode. He swept past her before she could reach him, every movement fueled by urgency rather than reunions. He ascended the stairs with precision, ignoring the sharp stabs radiating from his abdomen as he pushed himself up toward the small room at the end of the hall. Ha-joon was where he expected him to be. The boy's innocent presence, resting in the quiet safety of his room, was like a bomb and a blow all at once. Kang gathered him close and retrieved the hidden firearm he kept tucked in the compartment beneath the boy's dresser, one of the few precautions he had hoped to never need in this mansion. Below, the mansion's air had shifted. Susan, still buoyed by the shock and joy of Kang's return, hadn't noticed the gate standing wide open behind him. She moved quickly to fulfill his instructions, stepping out to secure the property before danger could seep in. Her heart was still pulsing with a mixture of relief, adrenaline, and renewed hope. She clung to the belief that Kang's escape meant strength, safety, and the beginning of resolution. But outside the gates, Linda had already arrived. Her anger had crystallized into something cold and precise, a rage sharpened by humiliation. Kang's escape had felt like a personal insult, a refusal to bend to her control, and she blamed Susan just as intensely as she blamed him. The open gate had made her path effortless. She slipped through it without hesitation, carrying the quiet, lethal purpose of someone who had crossed far past the boundary of reason. Her steps were measured and focused, her weapon held with steady intent as she advanced toward the mansion. Susan, unaware of how late she was, reached the gate with the expectation of securing it. The moment she stepped out, the world snapped into danger. Linda stood there already within the grounds, close enough for Susan to see the faint remnants of Kang's blood still staining the woman's sleeve, close enough for Susan to register the full, brutal reality of the threat she faced. The air thickened instantly, pressing against Susan's lungs, and her relief from moments earlier dissolved into a cold, rigid dread. Their standoff carried no words, only the suffocating awareness of imminent violence. Susan's mind raced through every decision, every action she could take, but the sight of the weapon Linda held froze the world around her. She felt the weight of Ha-joon's safety, the fragile hope that Kang had brought back with him, and the terrifying knowledge that the danger she had feared was now standing directly in front of her. Inside the mansion, Kang paused. Some primal instinct stirred within him, an unspoken warning threaded with urgency. He tightened his hold on Ha-joon and shifted his stance, listening for any sound from below. A subtle change in the atmosphere, an absence, a disruption, sent a surge of unease through him. The realization struck him with icy clarity. Susan was no longer inside. It was too late for warnings. The confrontation had already begun. Outside, Susan tried desperately to steady her voice, her mind racing for any path that could de-escalate the situation. She attempted explanations, reassurances, anything to stave off Linda's rising anger. But Linda was spiraling, drug-fueled paranoia and bitterness twisting every word Susan offered into something hostile. She hurled accusations as though each one were a blade, painting Susan as a thief, an intruder, a replacement, an enemy who had to be erased. Every gesture, every breath Susan took seemed only to provoke her further. The tension stretched painfully, a drawn wire on the verge of snapping. Susan could feel her own heartbeat in her throat, erratic and desperate, her body begging her to flee even though she knew running would trigger the shot she feared most. Her pleas grew softer, more frantic, more vulnerable as she realized Linda was slipping deeper into a state where reason no longer existed. The gun in Linda's hand wavered unpredictably, an extension of trembling fingers and raging delusions. Upstairs, Kang finally sensed something wrong. Perhaps the unnatural quiet outside, perhaps the faint, muffled hum of raised voices from the front of the mansion. He handed Ha-joon to safety and rushed toward the noise, every step echoing loud and sharp through the mansion halls. The urgency in his chest grew with every stride, dread clawing at him as he approached the front entrance. The moment he pushed open the doors, everything happened in a single, devastating instant. Linda's hand jerked upward with startling speed, fueled by panic and instability. Susan's body jolted as the bullet struck her abdomen, forcing the air from her lungs in a painful rush. Her knees buckled as fire exploded through her body, the world tilting violently as she reached instinctively for something, anything, to hold on to. Before the echo of the shot had faded, Kang reacted with pure, primal instinct. The sight of Susan falling, the woman who had protected his child, who had waited for him, who had unknowingly become his anchor, ignited something fierce and unstoppable within him. With unwavering precision, he fired back. Shot after shot tore through the night, each one driven by fury, fear, and a desperate determination to eliminate the threat before another innocent life was touched. Linda collapsed almost instantly, crumpling onto the ground in a lifeless heap, her weapon slipping uselessly from her grasp. The chaos stilled, replaced by a suffocating silence broken only by Susan's labored breaths. Kang dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he pressed down on her wound, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding. The blood seeped quickly between his fingers, warm and frighteningly abundant. Susan's eyes fluttered weakly, her skin paling, yet she remained conscious long enough to register his presence, his panic, his voice, though faint and distant in her spinning mind. He held her carefully, as though afraid she might break apart entirely, his body shielding hers from the cold night air. The world blurred around him. There was only Susan, her injury, and the growing terror that she might not survive the next few minutes. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with agonizing slowness. Kang stayed beside her, refusing to loosen his grip or look away even for a second. When the paramedics finally arrived, he allowed them to take over only because he knew he had no choice. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Susan's consciousness slipped, her body growing limp as she surrendered to the darkness. And Kang stood there, covered in her blood, holding his breath as the only woman who had ever managed to reach past his walls was taken away to fight for her life. The sterile white glow of the hospital room softened the chaos of the previous hours, filtering the world into something gentler, calmer, and almost unreal. Kang sat in a rigid plastic chair beside the bed, his clothes stained with dried blood. Most of it Susan's, some of it Linda's, and all of it a reminder of how close the day had come to breaking him. But for the first time since the nightmare began, his shoulders finally loosened, because Ha-joon slept soundly in his arms, his tiny face relaxed and peaceful, unaware of the violence that had nearly stolen the people who loved him. Susan stirred first, a groggy shift of her fingertips against the sheets, a small wince as the ache in her abdomen reminded her that she was alive. Barely, painfully, but undeniably alive. Her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she saw was Kang, exhausted, bruised, emotionally scraped raw, and cradling his son with a tenderness no one would have believed from a man known for his cold precision. It made her chest warm despite the burning pain. She blinked slowly, taking in the surreal domesticity of the moment, this dangerous, stern man rocking a baby to sleep with a concentration usually reserved for business empires and courtroom strategies. She found herself fascinated by the scene, wondering how he, of all people, had managed to calm the child who treated naps like personal insults. A faint, amused disbelief flickered across her expression as she silently marveled at his newfound skill. Kang noticed her awakening and immediately leaned forward, his posture shifting from stiff vigilance to overflowing relief that he struggled to hide. He looked both grateful and agitated, grateful she was alive, agitated she had scared him by nearly dying. Susan recognized the storm in his eyes, the attempt to remain stoic when everything in him was shaking. She let her gaze drift to Ha-joon resting against his chest, and a tiny, teasing smirk spread across her lips, even though she couldn't voice it. The expression alone conveyed her question. How on earth did he make the child sleep? Kang responded wordlessly with the faintest hint of pride, a subtle lift of his chin that implied he had accomplished something monumental. Susan couldn't stop the warm roll of laughter that echoed inside her chest, silent, breathless, but full of affection. The laughter brought a sting of pain to her in jury, but the moment was worth it. Soon, the room settled into a peaceful rhythm. Ha-joon's tiny breaths puffed softly against Kang's shirt while Susan, despite her injuries, found herself entertained simply watching the unusual domestic quiet that had wrapped itself around them. Kang, perhaps sensing her amusement, shifted the sleeping boy just slightly and lifted him toward his own chest in a ridiculous, exaggerated manner, clearly mimicking the way she usually nursed or soothed the baby. The gesture was so absurd, so completely out of character, that Susan nearly choked on her own startled gasp of disbelief. She glared at him with mock outrage, silently accusing him of committing a crime against good parenting and possibly good taste. Her expression alone warned him to stop pretending to breastfeed the boy before he traumatized someone. Kang smirked unapologetically, enjoying the reaction far too much. In his mind, Ha-joon clearly missed her comforting warmth, and he exaggerated this idea by patting his own chest with playful self-importance, suggesting that the baby was desperate enough to accept whatever poor imitation he could offer. Susan's reaction was swift. She reached for the nearest object within her limited mobility, some harmless little hospital tool resting on the tray beside her, and lobbed it at him with as much strength as her recovering body could manage. The item bounced off his shoulder harmlessly, but the dramatic offense she portrayed felt like a declaration of war. Kang merely chuckled under his breath, savoring the rare moment where danger wasn't hovering over them. The room warmed with soft, chaotic affection. Susan, despite the pain, felt a swell of joy rise through her. The horror of the day had folded into something gentler, domestic absurdity, quiet relief, and the wordless understanding that neither of them would ever forget the lengths he had gone to protect her. Kang watched her closely, his expression softer than she had ever seen, as though the sight of her awake and safe rewrote something fundamental inside him. And so the episode closed not with gunfire, fear, or blood, but with 3 lives tangled in warmth and ridiculous comfort, Kang's quiet laughter blending with Susan's amused scolding, and Ha-joon snuggled peacefully between them. Their world, broken and mended in the same day, finally felt whole.